spoiler, Labour are going to win the next election by a landslide. We need to talk about what a Labour government will mean in terms of Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. Some will go, well, we need to be talking about what the government's doing and all the rest of it. We've been talking about that for months, quite rightly. The British government under Rishi Sunak has directly facilitated one of the great crimes of our age, including continuing to sell arms, provide political public support for Israel, which it has done from the very start. And Rishi Sunak should be condemned for that for the rest of his life. But we have to scrutinise the next government. It doesn't make any sense now to focus on the Conservatives because there's less than no chance of them winning the next election. So we have to talk about what the next government, which will take power in about 2.5 weeks. And there's no better person to speak to than Hamza Yusuf, who is a brilliant British-Palestinian writer who we've interviewed before about the horror being facilitated by the British government. Hey, buddy, how you doing?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Very good, Hamza. Very good to see you as ever. So let's just start, actually. I want us to start with Keir Starmer, the next inevitable prime minister, so we're very clear about that, who was on LBC and was asked about whether Israel was committing genocide.
Abby in Paddington, does Sir Keir Starmer agree with the use of the word genocide?
In what sense?
I imagine in Gaza, the Israel committing genocide in Gaza.
Well, look, I've said repeatedly, Israel has to exercise its right to self-defense within international law. No, Abby, and anyway, I'm not going to sit in an LBC studio and pronounce that something is either genocide or not. And I'll tell you...
Yeah, this typifies what Keir Starmer is all about. I mean, even when he's asked, he's sitting in the studio and he's saying, "Oh, it's not for me to sit in the studio and decide what is a genocide." And obviously, he didn't have that same, didn't use that same yardstick when he was asked about Russia. I think whether there was committing a war crime or even a genocide. And this characterizes Keir Starmer's approach, especially on Palestine. He treats it with indifference. He treats the Palestinian cause with indifference. And there's no urgency on his end to even. I mean, this is the ICJ has said there's plausible genocide. We've passed the point of whether it is a genocide or whether if the word is acceptable to use. There is now precedent, if you like, and I know the case is still ongoing. But the fact Israel is on trial for genocide at the World Court is enough of a reason to actually begin applying the term. But he actually has form, because when he was asked about the Amnesty International report on apartheid, again he rejected it. And actually, if you talk about significance of what that means, if Israel begins to be treated as a genocidal state, a state that committed genocide, it applies that bit of pressure on them, and it's not a label any state would want to have. But by kind of shielding them from that and kind of just giving mealy-mouthed commitments about a Palestinian state, or without actually getting into how can that come about? How can we apply pressure on Israel? As I said, it typifies Keir Starmer's approach.
I think what's striking about it as well is, technically, we could listen to that clip and go, well, he hasn't ruled out the fact that Israel may be committing genocide. And the reason I bring that up is, if I take, I don't know, Afghanistan, the invasion of Afghanistan, I think terrible crimes were committed by Western forces. I don't think that was genocide. The invasion of Iraq, I think that's one of the great crimes of our age. I think it was a heinous bloodbath. I don't think that was genocide. The point I'm making is the threshold is very high for even contemplating whether or not a state is committing genocide. Like, if you think a state might, if you can't say, no, I don't think it's genocide, if you're not able to say that, then you must be indulging the idea that terrible crimes have been committed, and therefore it's open to debate and discussion about whether that could constitute genocide. Do you see what I mean? The point I'm making is, he has got to a point, in theory, where he's not ruling out genocide. You could frame that answer in that way, and yet he's still refusing to say he will stop arms. So the way of looking at that is, Keir Starmer is refusing to say he will end arms sales to a state he thinks may plausibly be committing genocide, or he's not ruling out the fact they're committing genocide. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and even then, it's the language, it's that typical robotic approach that he has with, especially on Palestine. Like I said, it's all about, he was asked by Nick Ferrari, or a caller was asked on LBC, put the question to him, would you suspend arms sales? And he said, well, we have to look into review of that. Now, Israel's committing a genocide. Okay, he doesn't like the word genocide. Let's use systematic mass slaughter, systematic ethnic cleansing, oppression, the annihilation of Gaza. And he has to look into the potential of Britain not assisting them, not providing them with arms, not providing with military material to allow them to carry out this mass slaughter of Palestinians. Again, he can't commit to anything, even something so simple. And what's striking is that even Nick Ferrari, who is a staunch supporter of Israel, even he was getting frustrated. He said, "What do you mean you're going to review it? Like, you can't even commit to openly saying, okay, look, we're going to suspend arms sales to Israel and sticking to that."
I mean, on that, it's quite striking that earlier this year, Alicia Kearns, the Conservative chair of the she's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. She's a Conservative. I actually would say he's done much better job at scrutinising the government over Gaza than Keir Starmer has. The bar is on the floor. Let's bear that in mind. But there was a leaked recording of her saying that the government had been told, they'd been given legal advice that Israel was in violation of international humanitarian law, which means the government has to end arms sales and end intelligence cooperation with Israel. But all Labour could do was say, release the legal advice, but they're not saying as a bare minimum, end arms sales. And it's quite striking in that context, because when actually asked about what they do when they come to government, they're not even saying they'll release the legal advice. They said that they would look at the legal advice or commission their own. But they're not at any point saying they will end arms sales, which is the legal obligation in that context. It's the bare minimum.
Yeah, and it's just a word salad devoid of any tangible thought or practical ways to move forward. He's kicking the can down the road, and that is what Keir Starmer does. And I think it is worth almost diving into what he has done in terms of on Palestine since he was elected, because it's very easy now. For example, he's in the manifesto, they've committed to a Palestinian state. Again, another mealy mouth commitment. And again, I make the point, the Palestinian state doesn't just mushroom from the ground. In order for you to have a legitimate process or unraveling or unpacking or dismantling the structures that allow Israel to continue its ethnic cleansing and apartheid and oppression of the Palestinians, you need to apply some level of pressure, whether that's economic isolation with BDS. He opposes that. Lisa Nandy opposes that. She was on the airwaves the other day saying nobody supports Palestinians like her. She's been committed and has a history of it. That's not the case. Obviously, they oppose BDS. They oppose the categorization of Israel as an apartheid state or practicing the crime of apartheid. They refuse to suspend arms sales, so placing that political pressure, potentially generating momentum from the ground up, so that potentially other states in Germany, actors can place pressure on the government. Look, Britain suspended arms sales, why don't we do the same, etc. That's how you generate momentum. That's how you apply economic, diplomatic, political pressure on Israel. That's how you begin the process of, okay, we can now start centering Palestinian rights, Palestinian aspirations, Palestinian ambitions, etc. But he's not interested in that. He's just going to look into review of arms sales, and he's going to commit to a Palestinian state. How are we going to commit to a Palestinian state? Nobody knows. So as I said, it's just commitments. It's just hot air, and the practical impact of that can't be understated, because it offers a smokescreen for Israel's ethnic cleansing. Nobody can now, in Keir Starmer's eyes, he sees it as nobody can accuse him of not centering the Palestinian rights because he's committed to a state. But on the ground, that Palestinian state, what does it look like? Well, Gaza's been annihilated. There are buffer zones. It's been carved into pieces. The West Bank, there's continued land grab going on, continued ethnic cleansing. Palestinian communities continue to be forcibly evicted. The Palestinians under occupation continue to have their rights stripped. There's a high level of torture in prisons, more imprisonment, more arrests. So that's the reality on the ground. And so by just giving these robotic recitations about two-state solution without offering tangible and practical solutions, it provides a smokescreen for Israel's ethnic cleansing. So it's arguably worse than not saying anything.
Because on that, just to underline how mealy-mouthed it is, Ireland, Spain and Norway came out and recognised the Palestinian state, which I would emphasise most countries on earth have actually done. I mean, that is actually the mainstream of what countries have done around the world. And they got hysterical attacks from the Israeli state, particularly going for the Spanish government, I would note, but also Ireland. And Labour's not committing to do that. I think it's very important people realise that. They're not saying we will recognise a Palestinian state in the way they've all done. They're making it clear. They're saying at some undefined point that will happen. And as you point, given the Israeli state is viciously, aggressively, publicly opposed to any form of Palestinian state, it is obviously waging war against the Palestinian people, occupying and colonising their land, you would have to take exceptionally firm action against the Israeli state in order for that to ever be a reality. So it doesn't mean anything. It means less than nothing, because it is literally just a platitudinous aspiration which doesn't have any underpinning.
And if you actually compare to, so he's obviously, it's just an empty word salad. It's just hot air when it comes to the Palestinians. But if you compare that to the kind of the categorical way in which he made sure there's no real condemnation of Israel, there is a stark difference. So this is a choice. He can apply that same level of, that same robust commitment to protecting or safeguarding Israel. I mean, if you go back to 2020, I think it was Stephen Kinnock, not the most progressive person, he mentioned that Israel is profiting from the proceeds of crime, effectively, when he mentioned the expansion of illegal settlements. And Keir Starmer gave him a dressing down, effectively. So anytime there's any kind of movement, any kind of momentum he generated when it comes to Palestinian state, he doesn't, or anything, just Palestinian solidarity, Palestinian, supporting the Palestinian cause, he's quick to shut that down. He hasn't supported the student encampments. He hasn't really said anything on the ICJ case. He's a human rights lawyer. He hasn't mentioned the arrest warrants or the application for the arrest warrants. So these are the avenues in which a Palestinian, I know it's obviously we're some way off that at the moment, but in terms of applying pressure on Israel, isolating it, as I mentioned, political, diplomatic, economic pressure, that it's through those avenues, these multi-pronged avenues. And it could start with a condemnation, with a suspension of arms sales. But when it comes to Israel and reiterating Israel has a right to defend itself, which is actually what he said when he was asked about the genocide, when it comes to even with a Palestinian state, goes ensuring it's next to a safe and secure Israel, etc., etc. Again, on Israel's terms, on a settler colonial state, but it's on their terms. So again, it's infuriating because it's just empty words, empty gestures, and empty gestures are what have allowed Israel for 30 years since the two-state solution and the so-called peace process, gave birth to the two-state solution. All we've heard is empty gestures and virtue signaling, and Keir Starmer's continuing down that path, and it impacts Palestinians because the land grab continues, the land theft continues, the ethnic cleansing, the systematic violence and oppression of Palestinians, because politicians just offer empty gestures.
Now, just in terms of the general hypocrisy of Keir Starmer on this, let's just listen to these two clips side by side.
As to whether each and every act is in accordance with the law, well, that will have to be adjudicated in due course. I think it's unwise for politicians to stand on stages like this or to sit in television studios and pronounce day by day which acts may or may not be in accordance with international law. I think it's not the role of politicians. Is Vladimir Putin a war criminal? Yes. What I've seen already amounts to war crimes, particularly the awful attacks on civilians.
So what he says in those clips were, firstly, about Israel, I think it's unwise for politicians to sit in TV studios and pronounce which acts may or may not be in accordance with international law. And then in the second clip, when asked about Russia, he said, what I've seen amounts to war crimes. What do you do with that then?
Exactly. I mean, that gives you an insight. Some lives are worth more than others. It's a hierarchy of human life. And the worst thing about it is that this is a former human rights lawyer, and with human rights, it should be a clear distinction. What one thing's right, one thing's wrong, but he can't commit to that. And it goes back to how can we expect or even buy all these so-called pledges and these commitments when we know full well he's going to backtrack, so we don't even know if a Palestinian state, if he's even going to commit to that. And if he can't even bring himself to condemn it, how can we expect him as British Prime Minister to then place pressure on Israel, or to actually have those negotiations, discussions that he will inevitably have with Israel when he can't even call a spade effectively?
I mean, on that as well, I mean, we know it's been obviously widely discussed, but it should always be raised that at the very start of this, he said that Israel had the cut. He answered to Nick Fry's on LBC. We just heard them. It was on that same show. Asked whether or not Israel had the right to impose a siege, to cut off water and energy. And he said, I think that Israel does have that right. And then sent various shadow cabinet ministers on TV, including my local MP, Emily Thornberry, to defend that particular point. And then 2 weeks later, gaslit people into saying never believed Israel had the right to do any such thing, which just underlies what a pathological liar that guy is. But at the same time, I mean, this is the point. I mean, you kind of alluded to, he's monstered and gone for anyone within the Labour Party who's actually taken a strong line. Andy MacDonald, a Labour MP, was suspended from the Labour Party when he called for, essentially, he used the phraseology of talking about from the river to the sea, Israelis and Palestinians will live in perfect harmony. So nobody could accuse, even the smear against that particular, the phraseology from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. He was making clear that claimed ambiguity couldn't exist because it just meant peaceful coexistence. Whilst Kate Osamor was suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party because she said that Gaza was a genocide on Holocaust Memorial Day, bearing in mind that Holocaust Memorial Day exists to remember all genocides committed since the Holocaust, so therefore you would have to include Gaza if you think it's a genocide. So that's the point, isn't it? I mean, it's just in practice, he opposed a ceasefire when, back in November, he went for the critics of it, and he supported the right of Israel to commit war crimes. It's not adding up to a great picture, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, and he thinks people have short memories. And it's interesting you mentioned about where his red lines are. So he has no issue standing at a Labour Friends of Israel lunch. I think they have the annual lunch, and sharing a platform with Zippy Hotovely, for example, the Israeli ambassador to the UK, who has made several genocidal statements even before and after October the 7th. I think she's also denied that Gaza was under siege or was occupied numerous times. I think that was Channel 4 on LBC. She was on Ian Dale's show and basically saying, what option do we have except to destroy buildings, etc., etc. So again, genocidal intent.
All buildings, yeah.
Yeah. So that's no problem. He can share a platform with her. And when she was protested, when she was speaking at the London School of Economics, I think 2 years ago, again, Keir Starmer, when people protested, he said, "Oh, this is anti-Semitic. We're allowing people to whip up anti-Semitic hatred by protesting this, etc., etc." His red lines are very different when it comes to anything associated to the Palestinians. When it comes to not sharing platforms, not saying certain things, he's categorical. Israel is not an apartheid state. There's no genocide being committed. BDS is anti-Semitic. Those are red lines. But then when it comes to calling out other things, he's happy to make it, to play, to keep it loose and to keep it effectively, like I said, hot air and just a word salad of emptiness.
I mean, in terms of this whole election, I think it is striking how little Gaza has been discussed at all. Bearing in mind the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor has issued requests for arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in a onslaught which has been directly supported by the British government and openly supported by the opposition. You might think that might be, if we had a functioning political system, that might be quite an important thing for us to discuss. Not least given it is obviously a priority for lots of people, that we've seen the consequences for that in terms of voters who've been disillusioned with the Labour Party. We saw that in terms of what happened in Rochdale earlier this year. We know that there are several independent candidates and who are standing on this basis and attracting a lot of support. But both our political elites and our media, much of our media, is just simply not engaging with it. They're treating it as though it's irrelevant in this election.
Yeah, and it goes back to something that's been discussed often, which is how the media frames things. So they know how they can frame a certain debate and get attention, as we've seen. For example, Nigel Farage, suddenly he's getting the most platforms. Suddenly he's been allowed to amplify and continue using his vitriol. But something as huge as that, I mean, that's significant. But when we do hear of it, we just hear, but it's just an application for an arrest warrant. It doesn't matter that this is from the International Criminal Court. It doesn't matter that Israel's on trial for genocide at the ICJ. None of these things seem to matter. They make them insignificant. They don't put it to the political leaders. And the political leaders themselves, as I said, by not saying anything, you're saying something. So Keir Starmer can easily take a stand and say, actually, the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, there are arrest warrants out for them, or there's application for arrest warrants. That's something for him to go with. That's something where he can apply a bit of pressure on him. He can say, if I'm elected, I'm not going to speak to Netanyahu until this is clear, or something along those lines. I'm not a diplomat. I don't know what route that can take. But I'm sure there are avenues which can be adopted. There are mechanisms that can be used where Keir Starmer uses this this key moment in which finally an element of Israel being held to account, and he could use that to build a case or center Palestinian rights. But instead, it's just ignored because, as I said, it's characteristic to his approach when it comes to treating Palestinians and their cause with indifference. And
on that too, in terms of who's tolerated and who's accepted and who's not, Faiza Shaheen, who was a local Muslim woman of colour, working class woman, defied the odds, became a successful academic, standing in her home constituency of Chingford and Woodford Green back in 2019, when obviously very difficult for Labour. There's one of the only places where there was a swing in favour of Labour. She was deselected by the party arbitrarily, attempted to publicly humiliate her with evidence amassed, including, for example, that she had, I think, liked a tweet or tweeted in support of the idea that Israel was an apartheid state, which is, as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Israeli human rights organisation B'Tselem define Israel. Whereas Lou Gatehurst, who is on the National Executive Committee, who then just carved up a load of seats to parachute themselves into Durham, a seat he has nothing to do with whatsoever. He's a southerner. I knew him in Hackney. He was a Hackney councillor. Then he moved to Oxford. Nothing to do with Durham. Parachutes himself in. He's someone who works for We Believe. He's director of We Believe in Israel, a pro-Israel lobbying group. The Israel Lobby, that's what that is. It exists. It's a fact. Has tweeted variously that the United Nations is anti-Semitic, opposed all calls for a ceasefire, and repeatedly claimed Israel does not commit any war crimes or violations at all on the basis that it has lawyers checking everything it does, which, when you read what those lawyers have said publicly, including the former chief military attorney in Israel saying that you have to destroy every building in Gaza because Hamas is everywhere, I think we can see what those legal experts are saying to the Israeli army. But I mean, you can see like who's acceptable and who's not, and that sums it up, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, and like I said, you can parachute a staunch pro-Israel lobbyist who unconditionally supports Israel into a safe seat, make him part of the Labour furniture, or you can hold Israel to account and champion Palestinian rights. You can't do both. But Keir Starmer's trying to, we know what his intentions are. We know where the party's going. And on the point, it's interesting because one of the tweets she liked was on the Israel lobby, and this guy is, ironically, his history suggests and illustrates that there is well and truly an Israel lobby, a pro-Israel lobby that works and operates. And on the topic, I mean, several of Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet have had trips to Israel funded, and David Lammy himself has had trips, funded trips to Israel. So she liked to tweet, and obviously they dealt with it the way that they did, and then to show, oh look, actually it's outrageous that you could even reference an Israel lobby. Oh, by the way, here the pro-Israel lobbyist who's going to be parachuted into a safe seat. It's ludicrous.
Finally, then, I mean, in terms of Labour and government, a lot of people might just feel a bit depressed listening to this, just because, I mean, the Tories are very justifiably going to get absolutely obliterated. They have wrecked the country, and obviously they've supported this genocidal onslaught. They're going to be what remains of them, the opposition, unless reform. I mean, Nigel Farage takes over, but again, I mean, he's obviously got a terrible reactionary position on all this as well. And Labour will have a massive majority full of lots of MPs who have a terrible position. So even though public opinion overwhelmingly, according to polls, think Israel's committed war crimes, that arms sales to Israel must immediately end, and they oppose overwhelmingly the military onslaught Israel has, which is genocidal in nature, has perpetrated, yeah, that's not going to get very much representation in Parliament at all. So kind of, what do we do?
We have to hope that the independents can shatter and eat into some of that majority. We have to apply that pressure. But in terms of what it means in practice, like you said, this is not going to be a party that, or a leader or prime minister that actually centers Palestinian rights. It's going to, I think, if you look at in terms of what, they say when the US sneezes, the world catches a cold. So Joe Biden, 4 years of pathetic policies, 4 years of, championing Israel at the worst possible time and kind of not really offering anything. And then within nothing of significance, and so immediately the right wing comes back in. I think there's a lesson there, but like I said, in practice, what it means for the Palestinians, Keir Starmer's rhetoric so far, and as I said, if you look at his history and the history of what and the tendencies of senior ministers within the party, he'll just continue as Labour has historically operated, which is to basically provide a smokescreen for ethnic cleansing. Because, as I said, Israel continues to consolidate its apartheid rule. It systematically displaces and kills Palestinians. It maintains Jewish supremacy from the river to the sea. And the thing that allows that, or the process that allows that, is empty gestures and kind of veneer of compassion, instead of actually saying, we're going to take a stance, we're going to take a stand, and we're going to actually apply some pressure on Israel. So we're going to hear numerous robotic recitations from Keir Starmer about the Palestinians, and more artificially balanced statements, but in the end, it's going to amount to nothing. And in that time, more Palestinians will be killed, more will be evicted. Gaza will remain under Israeli control. The West Bank's occupation will become entrenched. Israel's apartheid will be consolidated, all whilst our human rights lawyer of a prime minister looks on.
Bleak, but it does show, yeah, absolutely right. This is why, given Labour are going to win by a landslide, people should vote for either independents or Green Party candidates who clearly are going to take a stand, put pressure on Labour as well, that they feel they have to compete with parties which oppose genocide and candidates which oppose genocide, and that puts pressure on them as well. But it just shows that people need to keep organising, building up pressure, not least because we do have public opinion on our side. That's not actually the issue at this point. The issue is how we translate that into direct political pressure to stop Britain's direct complicity in one of the greatest crimes of our age. Hamza, it's such an honour. Please, those watching, listening, press like, subscribe, leave your comments. Always great engagement. Read all your comments. Encourages more people to watch, and that's what we want. We want to get the message out. Do listen to this podcast, but Hamza, honestly, such an honour to speak to you. Thanks for the brilliant insights as ever.
Pleasure.